Hey guys, tonight we dive into the grimy, stomach-churning world of medieval junk food, where market stalls hawk snacks so dubious you'd rather starve than take a bite. Picture yourself weaving through a bustling 14th century English market, the air thick with the stench of sour ale, rotting fish, and something suspiciously greasy sizzling over a fire. Vendors shout, waving moldy bread and questionable pies, their grins hiding the fact that this food might send you sprinting for the nearest bush. Want to know why you'd never touch this stuff? You're about to find out, but fair warning, surviving a medieval snack run might be tougher than you think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a muddy market square in York, 1350, where carts creak under piles of wilted cabbages and barrels of cloudy ale. Mainstream history tells us medieval street food was a staple for peasants, travelers, and even townsfolk, sold cheaply by vendors to feed the hungry between meals. Think of it as the fast food of its day, grubby, quick, and often barely edible, made from leftovers, scraps, or ingredients past their prime. You're dodging a donkey hauling turnips, your ruffled tunic snagging on a stall as a vendor, thrusts a skewer of grayish meat at you. The smell's a mix of burnt fat and regret, and you're already questioning your life choices. The market's alive with shouts, clinking coins, and the sizzle of oil, but nothing looks appetizing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some vendors swore their snacks were blessed by saints, claiming a nibble could cure aches or bad luck, convenient for selling dodgy goods. What skewer, no saintly glow in sight, and smirkinless saint food poisonings on duty. You're passing. Historians still argue whether medieval junk food was a practical necessity or a health hazard, with some saying it filled bellies in a pinch, while others point to frequent illnesses tied to spoiled eats. You're leaning toward hazard, the meat's glistening in a way that screams eat at your own risk. You wave Watt off, but he's persistent, his grin wider than the gap in his teeth. You're starting to see why this food was a gamble, why every bite was a roll of the dice. The market's chaos, dogs barking, a child swiping an apple pulls you deeper into its gritty pulse. You think back to modern fast food, greasy fries, questionable nuggets, and almost laugh. At least those come with health inspections. This is raw, unregulated survival, medieval style. You're tempted to grab a safer-looking loaf, but the moldy crusts on display stop you cold. You're impressed by the crowd's willingness to eat this stuff, but also queasy. Hunger must be a powerful motivator. You're starting to get the vibe of this place, where junk is an understatement. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a burger from a sketchy food truck and hoping for the best. The market stench swirls, but there's a story in every questionable skewer, and you're ready to dig in. Joke number 1. If this market had a Yelp page, it'd be 1 star for authentic vibes, instant regret. You're still weaving through York's muddy market square, the stench of Watt's dubious meat skewer lingering in your nostrils as you sidestep a puddle. That smells worse than the food. Your wool tunic's already speckled with market grime, and you're here to chew on the questionable bread-based junk food that medieval peasants relied on. Often stale, moldy, and barely fit for a dog. Mainstream history tells us bread was a staple across medieval Europe, but for the poor, it was often coarse, mixed with sawdust or chalk, and sold days or weeks past its prime as cheap street snacks. You're at a baker's stall now, where A weary vendor named Joan shoves a crusty loaf at you, its surface speckled with green patches that don't inspire confidence. The air's thick with the yeasty tang of bread, and the market's ever-present reek of sour ale. And your stomach's doing flips as you clutch the loaf, feeling its weight like a brick. You break off a piece, and it crumbles, revealing a fuzzy interior that screams mold. Joan swears it's just aged for flavor, but you're not buying it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed eating moldy bread could ward off evil humors, a folk remedy that probably caused more sickness than it cured. You imagine choking down this fuzz and praying for health, and you smirk medieval medicine. 0 stars. Historians still argue whether stale bread was a desperate necessity or a calculated risk, with some saying it was the only affordable food for the poor, while others think vendors knowingly sold spoiled goods to cut costs. You're leaning toward desperation. The crowd around you rag-clad laborers. Gaunt children is snapping up these loaves like they're gourmet. You nibble a corner, and it's like chewing gravel with a side of regret. You think back to Watt's greasy skewer, another gamble in this market's food lottery, and see bread as the backbone of medieval junk food, cheap, filling, but often a health hazard. The stakes are high. A bad loaf could mean days of gut pain, and there's no medieval Pepto-Bismol to save you. You notice a woman beside you, her hands calloused, happily munching a crust that looks like it's been through a war. You're impressed by her grit but queasy. Hunger's clearly a stronger force than taste buds. You try another bite, hoping Joan's aged flavor claim holds up, but it's like eating a moldy sponge, and you spit it out when she's not looking. You're starting to see why bread was both a lifeline and a curse. Why every crumb was a calculated risk. You're tempted to toss the loaf to a stray dog, but it's eyeing you like you're the snack. The market's chaos, vendors shouting, carts creaking swirls around you, the bread's stale weight grounding you in this gritty world. You think of modern snacks, stale chips, maybe, but nothing this dire, and almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival. You're starting to get why peasants ate this junk, why hunger trumped hygiene. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a week-old bagel from a gas station and calling it breakfast. The stall's shadow looms, but there's a story in every moldy crust, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this bread was a dating profile, it'd list mature, complex, probably toxic as traits. You're still in York's chaotic market square, the moldy bread from Joan's stall still weighing heavy in your hand, its fuzzy crumbs clinging to your wool tunic like a bad memory. As you dodge a cart of wilted cabbages, the market's stench sour, ale, rotting fish swirls around you, and you're here to taste the dubious meat pies peddled by vendors. Their greasy crusts and mystery fillings, a medieval gamble that could ruin your day. Mainstream history tells us meat pies were a popular street food in medieval Europe. Cheap and portable, but often stuffed with questionable offcuts, spoiled meat, gristle, or worse, masked by heavy spices or rancid fat. You're at a rickety stall now, where a vendor named Dickon, his apron stained with grease, thrusts a lumpy pie at you, its crust glistening like it's sweating. The air's thick with the smell of burnt pastry and something unsettlingly sour, and your stomach's already staging a protest as you grip the pie, its warmth suspiciously sticky. You break the crust, and a whiff of something funky like old socks meets bads to hits you. The filling's a grayish sludge, bits of cartilage floating like islands in a swamp. Dickon swears it's prime mutton, but you're betting on mystery meat, maybe rat or worse. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some vendors claimed their pies were blessed by the butcher's saint, a marketing trick to sell dodgy fillings as divine. You eye the pie, no saintly vibes in sight, and smirk unless the saint of indigestion's on call. You're skeptical. Historians still argue whether meat pies were a practical way to use scraps or a deliberate scam, with some saying they stretched scarce protein, while others think vendors knowingly pawned off spoiled goods. You're leaning towards scam. Dickons. Grin is to slick, and the piece smell screams eat at your peril. You take a tiny bite, and it's like chewing greasy regret, your throat begging for mercy. You think back to Joan's moldy bread, another risky bite in this market's food roulette, and see pies as the next level of danger. Portable, popular, but a digestive minefield. The stakes are high. One bad pie could mean a week of gut agony, and medieval doctors weren't exactly handing out probiotics. You notice a laborer beside you, scarfing a pie like it's his last meal, his face unbothered by the rancid tang. You're impressed by his iron stomach, but queasy, hunger's clearly a stronger motivator than caution. You try another nibble, hoping for a miracle, but the gristle crunches ominously, and you spit it into your sleeve when Dickon turns away. You're starting to see why pies were a medieval bestseller, cheap enough to tempt, but also why they were a health hazard dressed in pastry. You're tempted to chuck the pie at a stray dog, but it's already backing away. Smart pup. The market's din shouts, clinking coins, sizzling fat pulls you deeper into its gritty pulse. You think of modern fast food greasy burgers, questionable hot dogs, and almost laugh. At least those have FDA oversight. This is medieval takeout, with a side of survival. You're starting to get why people risked these pies, why a full belly trumped a safe one. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a shady taco from a street cart and praying it stays down. The stall's smoke stings your eyes, but there's a story in every greasy crumb, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this pie was a movie, it'd be Jurassic Pork. The leftovers strike back. You're still in York's bustling market, the greasy aftertaste of Dickon's mystery meat pie coating your tongue like a bad decision, its soggy crust crumbling in your hand as you weave past a donkey, laden with leeks, your wool tunics, speckled with grease stains now. And you're here to learn why the rancid fats and reused oils in medieval cooking turned even the hardiest stomachs. Mainstream history tells us medieval street food was often fried or cooked in fats, lard, tallow, or oil that were reused until they went rancid, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria, and a key reason junk food was so disgusting. You're at a stall where a vendor named Maud, her face shiny with sweat, fries doughy fritters in a bubbling cauldron of oil that smells like it's been through a war. The air's thick with acrid smoke, and the market's usual stench of sour ale, and your stomach's doing somersaults as you eye the fritters, their golden surface hiding a world of trouble. The Maud scoops a fritter from the oil, its sheen more suspicious than appetizing, and hands it to you on a splintered wooden stick. The oil's dark, flecked with charred bits, and you're pretty sure it's been reused since last week's market. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some vendors believed rancid oil strengthened the spirit, claiming its pungent flavor warded off disease. A medieval health hack that likely sent more folks to the grave. You imagine Maud pitching this as a superfood, and smirk. Rancid oil, the original detox cleanse. Historians still argue whether reused fats were a necessity or sheer negligence, with some saying scarce resources forced vendors to stretch every drop, while others think they cut corners to boost profits. You're leaning toward negligence. Maud's cauldron looks like a science experiment gone wrong, and her grin says she knows it. You bite the fritter, and it's like chewing a greasy sponge, the oil leaving a bitter, sour trail down your throat. You think back to Dickon's meat pie. Its funky filling, a cousin to this oily disaster. And see fats as the grim glue of medieval junk food, cheap, filling, but a health nightmare. The stakes are high. Eating this could mean days of gut pain. And there's no medieval Imodium to bail you out. You notice a skinny apprentice beside you, gobbling a fritter like it's his only meal today, his face unfazed by the rancid tang. You're impressed by his resilience, but queasy, hunger's clearly a stronger force than taste. You try another nibble, hoping for a less offensive bite, but the oil's bitterness makes you gag, and you discreetly drop the fritter into a puddle. When Maud's back is turned, you're starting to see why fats were a cornerstone of street food, and why they made every bite a gamble. You're tempted to rinse your mouth with ale, but the barrels nearby look just as dodgy. The market's chaos, vendors haggling, dogs snarling swirls around you, the cauldron's smoke stinging your eyes. You think of modern fried snacks, crispy fries, maybe, but cooked in fresh oil, and almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why people ate this junk. Why a warm fritter trumped an empty belly. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like eating fries from a diner's week-old oil and hoping for the best. The stall's heat fades, but there's a story in every rancid bite, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this oil was a perfume, it'd be called Eau de Regret, Vintage Misery. You're still in York's grimy market square, the rancid fritter's oily aftertaste clinging to your tongue like a curse. Maud's smoky cauldron still hissing as you sidestep a pile of rotting cabbage leaves. Your wool tunic's now a canvas of grease and crumbs, and you're here to try the spoiled dairy snacks, rancid cheese, and curdled milk treats that medieval folks somehow stomached as junk food. Mainstream history tells us dairy was a common street food in medieval Europe, but without refrigeration, cheese often turns sour and milk curdled quickly. Yet vendors sold these as cheap, protein-packed bites for the hungry. You're at a stall where a vendor named Agnes, her apron stiff with stains, offers you a chunk of pale, sweaty cheese on a wooden board, its smell hitting you like a punch of ammonia and regret. The air's thick with the market's usual stench, sour ale, burnt fat plus a new whiff of fermented funk, and your stomach's already begging for mercy as you grip the cheese. Its surface suspiciously slick. You pinch a piece, and it squishes, leaving a sticky film on your fingers. Agnes swears it's ripe for flavor, but the pungent whiff says it's been aging since the last crusade. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed rancid cheese boosted courage, a folk notion that brave souls ate it before battles to channel warrior spirits. You imagine chomping this before a fight and smirk only if the spirit of nausea counts. Historians still argue whether spoiled dairy was a practical use of surplus, or a health risk pawned off on the poor, with some saying it was a way to avoid waste, while others think vendors knowingly sold tainted goods for profit. You're leaning toward risk. This cheese looks like it could knock out a horse, and Agnes's sly grin isn't helping. You nibble a corner, and it's like biting into sour, gritty wax. Your throat staging a full rebellion. You think back to Maud's rancid oil, another grim staple of this market's junk food scene, and see dairy as its equally vile cousin, cheap, filling, but a digestive disaster. The stakes are high. One bad bite could mean days of gut trouble, and medieval healers were more likely to bleed you than cure you. You notice a scrawny boy beside you, happily chewing a lump of curdled milk solids Agnes calls fresh curds, his face unbothered by the sour tang. You're impressed by his iron gut, but queasy. Hunger's clearly a stronger motivator than hygiene. You try another nibble, hoping for a less offensive bit, but the cheese's rancid bite makes you gag. And you discreetly tuck it into your sleeve when Agnes turns away. You're starting to see why dairy was a market mainstay, and why it was a gamble wrapped in curds. You're tempted to chug some ale to wash it down, but the barrels look as sketchy as the cheese. The market's din shouts, clattering carts. A dog's bark swirls around you, the stall's stench grounding you. In this gritty world, you think of modern snacks, expired yogurt, maybe, but nothing this vile land almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why people ate this junk, why a full belly trumped a safe one. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a yogurt past its date from a bodega fridge and hoping it's still good. The cheese's funk lingers, but there's a story in every sour bite, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this cheese was a superhero, it'd be Captain Rancid, fighting taste buds everywhere. You're still in York's raucous market square. The rancid cheese's sour tang still burning your throat, its sticky residue smearing your wool tunic as you push past a crowd haggling over wilted herbs. The market stench sour ale, burnt, fat, and now a whiff of fermented dairy clings to you, and you're here to sample the overripe, wormy fruit sold as snacks, a medieval junk food staple that's as disgusting as it sounds. Mainstream history tells us fruit was a common street food in medieval Europe, especially for the poor. But without proper storage, it often rotted or became infested with worms. Yet vendors peddled it as a cheap, sweet treat. You're at a rickety stall where a vendor named Ralph, his hands stained with juice, offers you a bruised, squishy apple, its skin speckled with dark spots and a faint wriggle that sets your nerves on edge. The air's thick with the cloying smell of overripe produce and the market's usual chaos, and your stomach's already staging a revolt as you grip the apple, its softness feeling like a warning. You slice it open with a borrowed knife, and a tiny worm squirms in the mushy core, confirming your worst fears. Ralph shrugs, calling it nature's spice, but you're not buying his sales pitch. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval folk believed eating wormy fruit cleansed the blood, a folk remedy that likely spread more parasites than purity. You imagine swallowing a worm for health and smirk. Medieval wellness trends, hard pass. Historians still argue whether overripe fruit was a practical use of spoiled harvests, or a shameless way to offload garbage, with some saying it stretched scarce food, while others think vendors exploited the hungry with inedible scraps. You're leaning toward exploitation. Ralph's grin is too smug, and this apple's more compost than cuisine. You nibble a worm-free edge, and it's sickly sweet, like candy gone wrong, your teeth grinding on grit. You think back to Agnes's rancid cheese, another market gamble that left your stomach churning, and see fruit as its sweeter but equally vile cousin, cheap, tempting, but a health trap. The stakes are high. A bad apple could mean gut trouble or worse, and medieval medicine was more prayer than cure. You notice a gaunt woman beside you, munching a pear that's half rotten, her face unfazed as she spits out a worm. You're impressed by her grit but queasy. Hunger's clearly a stronger force than caution. You try another bite, hoping for a cleaner piece, but the mushy texture and faint wriggle make you gag, and you discreetly toss the apple into a pile of refuse when Ralph's distracted. You're starting to see why fruit was a market staple, and why it was a dice roll wrapped in peel. You're tempted to grab a less dodgy-looking plum, but the buzzing flies are out at say nope. The market's clamor, vendors shouting, carts creak, a child's wail swirls around you, the stall's overripe stench grounding you in this gritty world. You think of modern snacks, moldy strawberries, maybe, but tossed, not sold, and almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why people ate this junk. Why a sweet bite trumped an empty belly. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a bruised banana from a discount bin and hoping it's worm-free. The fruit's cloying scent lingers, but there's a story in every rotten core, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this apple was a dating app bio, it'd read sweet but buggy, swipe at your risk. You're still in York's chaotic market square, the wormy apple's sickly sweetness still haunting your taste buds. Its mushy remains smeared on your wool tunic as you dodge a stray dog, sniffing the refuse pile. The market's stench rotting. Fruit, rancid oil, and sour ale swirls around you, and you're here to munch on the soggy, ale-soaked scraps served in rowdy taverns. A medieval junk food staple that's as unappetizing as it sounds. Mainstream history tells us taverns were social hubs in medieval towns, where patrons gobbled up cheap leftover stale bread, meat scraps, or vegetable ends often doused in ale to mask their staleness or spoilage. You're stumbling into a dim tavern just off the market, its air thick with the reek of spilled ale and sweat, where a barkeep named Tom slaps a wooden trencher of soggy bread and fatty meat bits in front of you, the whole mess swimming in a murky ale broth. Your stomach's already bracing for impact as you poke the trencher, the bread dissolving like a sad sponge. You scoop a piece, and it drips, the ale's bitterness cutting through the meat's questionable tang. Think Jim Sock's meat's cheap beer. Tom claims it's hearty tavern fare, but you're betting it's yesterday's kitchen scraps. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some tavern goers believed ale-soaked food fortified the soul, a folk notion that it could cure melancholy or even love woes. You imagine drowning your sorrows in this slop and smirk only if the cure's worse than the disease. Historians still argue whether tavern scraps were a practical way to repurpose leftovers, or a lazy dodge of proper cooking, with some saying they fed the hungry cheaply, while others think barkeeps pawned off garbage to drunk patrons. You're leaning toward garbage. Tom's smirk says he knows this trencher's a lost cause. You take a bite, and it's like chewing a wet rag with a side of gristle, your throat begging for mercy. You think back to Ralph's wormy apple, another market gamble that left you queasy, and see tavern scraps as its boozy, equally vile cousin cheap. Filling, but a digestive disaster. The stakes are high. This soggy mess could spark gut trouble, and medieval bathrooms weren't exactly a safe haven. You notice a red-faced laborer beside you, slurping the broth like it's gourmet, his ale mug already half empty. You're impressed by his iron stomach but nauseated. Hunger and a buzz clearly trump taste. You try another bite, hoping for something edible, but the meat's slimy texture makes you gag, and you discreetly slide the trencher under the table when Tom's busy. You're starting to see why tavern food was a hit with the desperate, and why it was a health hazard dressed in ale. You're tempted to order a fresh drink, but the mugs look as grimy as the food. The tavern's din raucous laughter, clinking mugs. A lute's twang wraps you in its gritty pulse. The trencher's stench grounding you in this rough world. You think of modern bar snacks, stale pretzels, maybe, but rarely this die-rand almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why people ate this junk, why a warm bite trumped an empty gut. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like scarfing bar peanuts soaked in spilled beer, and calling it a meal. The tavern's smoke stings your eyes, but there's a story in every soggy crumb, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this trencher was a Yelp review, it'd be 5 stars for drowning my taste buds. In despair, you're still in the dim, rowdy tavern. The soggy ale-soaked trencher's bitter aftertaste lingering like a bad hangover. Its greasy crumbs clinging to your wool tunic as you shove the wooden plate away and dodge a sloshed patron's elbow. The tavern's reek of sweat and spilled ale mixes with the market's distant stench, and you're here to savor the rare, cavity-inducing sugary sweets that pass for medieval junk food. Treats so scarce and tooth-rotting they'd make your dentist weep. Mainstream history tells us sugar was a luxury in medieval Europe, imported at great cost from the Middle East. So sweets like honey-dipped pastries or crude candies were mostly for the wealthy. But street vendors occasionally sold cheap, gritty versions to tempt the masses. You're back in the market now, drawn to a small stall where a vendor named Cecily, her fingers sticky with honey, offers you a lumpy, amber-colored lump she calls a sugar cake. The air's thick with the cloying scent of burnt syrup and the market's usual sour tang, and your stomach's wary after the tavern's slop. But the sweet's golden glow is oddly tempting. You take the sugar cake, its surface gritty with what might be sand or worse, and it sticks to your fingers like medieval glue. Cecily swears it's fit for a lord, but the price a day's wages for a peasant says it's a rare treat. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed eating sweets under a full moon boosted love luck, a superstition that had market goers sneaking candies at night. You glance at the cloudy sky, no moon in sight, and smirk, guess your love life safe from this lump. Historians still argue whether sugary sweets were a status symbol or a risky indulgence, with some saying they flaunted wealth, while others think their rarity made them a dangerous obsession. For the poor, you're leaning toward dangerous. This cake's texture screams dental disaster, and Cecily's grin suggests she's banking on your sweet tooth. You bite in, and it's like chewing crunchy molasses, your teeth grinding on grit that's definitely not sugar. You think back to the tavern's ale-soaked scraps, another grim bite in this junk food saga, and see sweets as a rare but equally perilous treat, pricey, tooth-rotting, and often impure. The stakes are high. A bad batch could upset your gut, and medieval dentistry was more pliers than polish. You notice a young apprentice beside you, savoring a similar lump, his grin wide despite a blackened tooth. You're impressed by his enthusiasm but queasy. Hunger for sweetness clearly trumps oral health. You try another nibble, hoping for pure honey, but the grit crunches ominously, and you discreetly spit it into your sleeve when Cecily's distracted. You're starting to see why sweets were a medieval obsession, and why they were a gamble wrapped in syrup. You're tempted to grab a less gritty piece, but the stall's dwindling stock looks just as sketchy. The market's chaos, vendors shouting, a donkey's bray, clinking coins swirls around you, the stall's sticky scent grounding you in this rough world. You think of modern candies, gummy bears, chocolate bars, and almost laugh. At least those won't break your teeth. This is medieval junk food, with a side of dental roulette. You're starting to get why people crave these sweets. Why a fleeting sugar rush trumped the risks. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like buying knockoff candy from a shady vendor and hoping it's not chalk. The market's din pulses, but there's a story in every gritty bite, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this sugar cake was a dessert menu item, it'd be cavity crunch, sweet pain guaranteed. You're still in York's gritty market square, the sticky grit of Cecily's sugar cake still coating your teeth, its syrupy residue smearing your wool tunic as you brush past a crowd haggling over wilted greens. The market's stench sour, ale, rotting fruit, and burnt fat swirls around you, and you're here to uncover the shady tricks street vendors used to sell their disgusting junk food. turning spoiled goods into tempting snacks with a side of deception. Mainstream history tells us medieval vendors often cut corners, using spices, lies, or outright fraud to mask spoiled or low-quality food, exploiting the hungry and trusting to make a quick profit. You're back at Dickon's pie stall, where the greasy vendor from the meat pie fiasco is now hawking fresh fritters, his loud pitch drawing a small crowd despite the rancid whiff from his cauldron. The air's thick with oily smoke, and the market's chaotic din, and your stomach's on high alert after the sugar cake's dental assault. But you're curious how Dickon's pulling off this con. You lean in, watching him sprinkle a pinch of costly pepper over a fritter, claiming its lord's quality, though the dough's grayish hue screams yesterday's scraps. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some vendors rubbed their food with nettles, believing it gave a fresh sting. That fooled buyers into thinking it was newly made. You imagine Dickon stinging his pies and smirk sneaky, but it's not hiding that rancid smell. Historians still argue whether these tricks were clever marketing or outright scams, with some saying vendors had to compete in tough markets, while others think they preyed on the desperate with no regard for health. You're leaning towards scams. Dickon's wink as he hands a fritter to a gullible laborer says he knows it's garbage. You take one, its surface suspiciously shiny, and the oily tang confirms it's cooked in the same rancid fat you dodged at Maud's stall. You think back to Cecily's gritty sugar cake, another market hustle, and see vendor tricks as the glue, holding this junk food world together, spices masking rot, lies masking reality. The stakes are high. A bad fritter could sicken a buyer, and there's no medieval FDA to file a complaint with. You notice a woman beside you, inspecting her fritter with a frown, then shrugging and biting in hunger's clearly a stronger force than suspicion. You're impressed by her resilience but wary. Dickon's pepper trick might fool the nose, but your gut's not falling for it. You nibble the edge, and it's like biting into spiced regret, the rancid oil overwhelming the pepper's kick. You discreetly drop it into a pile of straw when Dickon's distracted, your stomach thinking. You're starting to see why vendors relied on these ruses, and why buyers kept falling for them. Desperation makes anything edible. You're tempted to call Dickon out, but his burly frame says, keep walking. The market's clamor, vendors shouting, a cart's creak, a child's wail pulses around you, the stall's smoke grounding you in this deceptive world. You think of modern food scams, fake organic labels, maybe, but rarely this blatant, and almost laugh. This is medieval fast food, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why tricks thrived, why a spiced lie trumped an empty belly. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like buying gourmet hot dogs from a cart that's never seen a health inspector. The market's din swirls, but there's a story in every dubious fritter, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If Dickon's stall was a brand, it'd be Trust Me Foods, where flavor hides the truth. You're still in York's bustling market square, Dickon's spiced fritters rancid aftertaste still burning your throat. Its oily crumbs joining the growing mess on your wool tunic as you slip away from his stall, dodging a cart of moldy onions, the market stench sour ale, rotting produce, and burnt grease wraps around you. And you're here to see why medieval peasants, driven by hunger, ate these disgusting scraps, turning spoiled junk food into a grim necessity. Mainstream history tells us hunger was a constant shadow for medieval peasants, with scarce harvests, high taxes, and no safety nets forcing them to eat whatever was cheap or available, no matter how rancid or wormy. You're following a gaunt laborer named Watt, the same guy who tried to sell you that sketchy meat skewer. As he shuffles to a tavern's back alley, where a pile of discarded scraps, soggy bread, fatty meat ends, curdled curds awaits the desperate. The air's thick with the tavern's reek of stale ale, and the alley's sour rot, and your stomach's in knots as you watch Watt rummage, his hands trembling with need. He grabs a chunk of bread, its green patches matching the moldy loaf from Joan's stall, and tears into it, his face set with grim determination. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed eating spoiled food toughened the spirit, a folk notion that it built resilience against famine's grip. You imagine Watt chomping mold for grit and smirk tough spirit, sure, but his guts, probably staging a revolt. Historians still argue whether eating such scraps was a survival strategy or a tragic last resort, with some saying peasants adapted to maximize scarce resources, while others think hunger left them no choice but to risk illness. You're leaning toward last resort. Watt's hollow cheeks and frantic bites scream desperation, not strategy. You pick up a piece of curdled curd, its stench like Agnes's rancid cheese, and your hand recoils. No way, you're that hungry. You think back to Dickon's pepper-tricked fritters, another market scam that preyed on the hungry, and see these alley scraps as the bottom rung of the junk food ladder. Free, but barely food. The stakes are high. Eating this could mean sickness or worse, and medieval remedies were more prayer than medicine. You notice a woman nearby, her shawl ragged, sifting through the pile for anything edible, her child clinging to her skirt. You're impressed by their endurance but heartsick. Hunger's a cruel master, forcing choices you can't imagine. You try sniffing the curd again, hoping it's less vile, but the sour funk makes you gag, and you toss it back when Watt's not looking. You're starting to see why peasants ate this junk, why survival trumped safety every time. You're tempted to offer Watt your leftover sugar cake from Sicily, but it's probably just as bad. The alley's gloom, rats scurrying, a distant tavern shout grounds you in this desperate world. The peel's stench, a grim reminder of the market's false promises. You think of modern hunger food banks, maybe, but with safety standards, and almost laugh. This is medieval survival, with a side of digestive roulette. You're starting to get why hunger drove these choices, why a moldy crust was better than nothing. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like digging through a dumpster for expired sandwiches and calling it a win. The market's din echoes faintly, but there's a story in every rancid scrap, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If Watt's meal was a cooking show, it'd be Chopped. Desperation edition. Mold basket. You're still in the grim alley behind the tavern. Watt's desperate crunching of moldy bread echoing in your ears as the pile of rancid scraps, curdled curds, fatty meat ends looms like a medieval landfill, its stench mixing with the market's sour ale and rotting fruit. Your tunic's a mess of grease and crumbs, and you're here to discover that even noble feasts, far from the alley's desperation, hid spoiled delicacies, making junk food a problem even for the wealthy. Mainstream history tells us medieval noble feasts were lavish displays of wealth, with tables groaning under roasted meats, spiced pies, and rare fruits. But poor storage and transport meant even these delicacies often arrived spoiled, masked by heavy spices to fool the palate. You're trudging out of the alley, following a cobbled path to a lord's manor just outside York, its stone walls gleaming under a gray sky. You're ushered into a grand hall, where Lord Reginald presides over a feast, his velvet cloak a stark contrast to Watt's rags. The air's thick with the scent of cloves and roasted boar, but a faint whiff of something off-sour almost makes your stomach clench as you're handed a trencher of spiced venison by a servant, Joan, who avoids your gaze. You poke the venison, its surface glossy with a spice crust that can't hide the grayish meat beneath. It smells suspiciously close to Dickon's market pies. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some nobles believed eating slightly spoiled food proved their noble constitution, a bizarre flex that rotting delicacies were a test of strength. You imagine Lord Reginald chowing down on rancid board to flex his gut and smirk medieval machismo, meat food poisoning. Historians still argue whether noble feasts hid spoilage out of necessity or arrogance, with some saying long supply chains left no choice, while others think lords ignored risks to maintain appearances. You're leaning toward arrogance. Joan's quick glance at the trencher says she knows it's dodgy, but the lord's table must shine. You nibble a piece, and it's like chewing spiced regret, the sour tang cutting through the cloves, your throat begging for a pass. You think back to Watts' alley scraps, the desperation that drove him to eat mold, and see noble feasts as a gilded version of the same gamble, spoiled food dressed up with spices instead of ale. The stakes are high. A bad dish could sicken the lord's guests, souring alliances or sparking rumors of weakness. You notice a knight beside you, his face flushed from wine, happily carving into a pie that smells like it's past its prime. You're impressed by his nonchalance but queasy. Even wealth can't outrun rot. You try another bite, hoping the spices work magic, but the meat's slimy texture makes you gag, and you discreetly tuck it under a bread crust when Joan's back is turned. You're starting to see why noble feasts were as risky as market stalls, why even lords rolled the dice with their dinners. You're tempted to stick to the bread, but it looks as stale as the market's loaves. The hall's clamor loots, laughter, clinking goblets wraps you in its deceptive glow. The trenchers, sour whiff grounding you in this flawed world. You think of modern fine dining health codes, fresh ingredients, and almost laugh. This is medieval luxury, with a side of digestive roulette. You're starting to get why spoilage haunted every table, why even nobles ate junk food in disguise. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like serving expired caviar at a gala and calling it vintage. The feast's torchlight flickers, but there's a story in every tainted bite, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this venison was a wine, it'd be Chateau Rancid, 1350, Bad Vibe Reserve. You're still in Lord Reginald's Grand Hall, the sour tang of the spiced venison lingering on your tongue like a betrayal, its greasy crumbs joining the mess on your wool tunic. As you push the trencher away, the feast's torchlight casting a deceptive glow over the clinking goblets. The hall's clove-scented air barely masks the whiff of spoilage, and you're here to explore the failed attempts to regulate medieval junk food, where food laws aimed to curb vendors' scams but dodgy enforcement let disgusting snacks thrive. Mainstream history tells us medieval towns like York had laws to control food quality, fining bakers for moldy bread or butchers for rancid meat. But corruption, lax oversight, and desperate hunger often rendered these rules toothless. You're slipping out of the manor, back to the muddy market square, where a town official, Master Hugh, patrols the stalls, his ledger tucked under his arm as he eyes vendors like Dickon with suspicion. The air's thick with the market's usual stench: sour ale, rotting fruit, burnt fat, and your stomach still reeling from the venison as you trail Hugh, hoping to see justice for the market's grim offerings. Hugh stops at Maud's fritter stall, sniffing her cauldron of rancid oil and scribbling a note, but Maud slips him a coin, and he moves on without a word. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some officials believed inspecting food under a new moon ensured pure findings, a superstition that justified half-hearted checks. You glance at the cloudy sky, no moon in sight, and smirk. Guess use purities. On hold, Historians still argue whether food laws were earnest attempts at public health or mere revenue schemes, with some saying they aimed to protect buyers, while others think fines enriched corrupt officials. You're leaning towards schemes. Use pocket jingles as he ignores a pile of wormy apples at Ralph's stall. You pick up a fritter Maud offers, its oil as foul as before, and realize these laws aren't saving anyone from the markets. Junk food roulette. You think back to the noble feast, where even Lord Reginald's table hid spoilage, and see the market's scams as a broader problem, laws or no laws. Bad food was everywhere. The stakes are high. Without real enforcement, vendors like Maud keep peddling rancid goods, and buyers like Watt from the alley keep getting sick. You notice a woman arguing with a baker over a moldy loaf, her voice sharp, but Hugh just shrugs and walks away. You're impressed by her nerve but frustrated. The system's rigged, and the hungry pay the price. You nibble the fritter, hoping Hugh's presence means it's fresher. But the sour oil hits like a punch, and you discreetly toss it into a ditch when Maud's not looking. You're starting to see why food laws failed, why the market stayed a minefield of mold and rot. You're tempted to call out Hugh's bribery, but his stern glare says mind your business. The market's din, vendors shouting, a donkey's bray. Clinking coin swirls around you, the cauldron's smoke grounding you in this flawed world. You think of modern food safety FDA raids, health codes, and almost laugh. This is medieval regulation, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why enforcement flopped, why rancid snacks kept flowing. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent. Like a health inspector taking a bribe to ignore a roach-infested food truck. The market's chaos pulses, but there's a story in every tainted fritter, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If Hugh's ledger was a report card, it'd give the market an F for fails at food safety. You're still in York's muddy market square, the rancid fritter's oily sting fading from your tongue. But its greasy mark joins the growing stains on your wool tunic as you step away from Maud's stall. Use corrupt coin jingle echoing in your ears. The market stench sour ale, rotting fruit, burnt grease clings to you, and you're here to meet the women who crafted these questionable snacks. Their role in preparing medieval junk food often overlooked but vital to the markets. Grim offerings. Mainstream history tells us women in medieval towns, like Agnes or Maud, were key players in food production, baking bread, frying fritters, or churning cheese for market stalls, their labor fueling the junk food trade despite the spoilage and scams. You're trailing a woman named Ellen, her apron caked with flour, as she kneads dough at a stall piled with lumpy loaves and greasy pastries. The air's thick with the yeasty tang of bread and the market's usual rot, and your stomach's wary after Hugh's failure to clean up this food mess. But you're curious about Ellen's craft in this gritty world. Ellen slaps dough onto a wooden board, her hands deft despite the cold, shaping it into fritters she'll fry in a cauldron of oil that smells like Maud's rancid batch. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women believed singing to their dough ensured lively bread, a folk charm thought to make it rise and sell better. You catch Ellen humming softly and smirk lively, or not. That oil's a deal breaker. Historians still argue whether women's food prep was a skilled trade or exploited labor, with some saying it gave them economic power, while others think they were stuck with low pay. High-risk tasks like handling spoiled ingredients. You're leaning toward exploited. Ellen's brow is furrowed, her hands chapped, and the moldy flour sack beside her suggests she's working with scraps. You try kneading a bit of dough she offers, but it's sticky and gray, and your lump looks more like a rock than a fritter. You think back to use lax enforcement, letting vendors like Dickon peddle tainted pies, and see women like Ellen as the unsung cogs in this junk food machine, crafting snacks under pressure with little reward. The stakes are high. A bad batch could spark customer complaints or illness, costing her livelihood. And there's no medieval union to back her up. You notice another woman nearby, stirring curds for cheese like Agnes's rancid lumps, her face set with quiet grit. You're impressed by their endurance but uneasy. They're feeding a town with food that's barely safe. You taste a fritter Ellen fries, hoping her skill outshines the oil. But the sour tang hits like a rerun of Maud's Disaster, and you discreetly spit it into your sleeve when she's distracted. You're starting to see why women were key to this trade, and why their work was a gamble with every need. You're tempted to ask Ellen about her humming charm, but her tired eyes say she's too busy for chat. The market's clamor, vendors shouting, a cart's creak, a dog's bark swirls around you. The stall's flour dust grounding you in this labor-filled world. You think of modern food prep, sanitized kitchens, safety gloves, and almost laugh. This is medieval cooking, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why women's roles mattered, why their hands shaped every dubious bite. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like line cooks at a greasy diner churning out fries with no time to breathe. The market's din pulses, but there's a story in every lumpy loaf, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If Ellen's stall was a cooking show, it'd be chopped, moldy flour, sad oil challenge. You're still in York's chaotic market square. Ellen's gritty fritter dough still clinging to your fingers. Its rancid oil aftertaste joining the parade of bad flavors on your wool tunic. As you step away from her flour-dusted stall, the market stench, sour ale, rotting produce, burnt grease swirls around you, and you're here to sneak forbidden treats during religious fasts. When medieval church rules banned rich foods, but hungry folks found ways to cheat with junk food. Mainstream history tells us the medieval church enforced strict fasting periods, like Lent, forbidding meat, dairy, or sweets to promote spiritual purity. But many peasants and nobles alike snuck snacks like greasy pies or sugary lumps to curb cravings, often in secret to dodge priests' wrath. You're slipping into a shadowy alley off the market, where a vendor named Giles, his cloak stained with grease, peddles fast friendly fritters under the table, winking at a small crowd of shifty-eyed buyers. The air's thick with the alley's damp rot and the faint sizzle of Giles's hidden cauldron, and your stomach's on edge after Ellen's fritters. But the thrill of forbidden food pulls you in. Giles hands you a fritter, claiming it's fish-based, to skirt Lent's rules. But the familiar rancid oil smell screams Dickon's meat pie vibes, and you spot a suspicious gristly bit inside. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some believed eating fast-breaking snacks in secret tricked the devil, a folk notion that sneaking a bite outsmarted sin itself. You imagine munching this fritter to fool Satan and smirk clever, but your guts, not convinced. Historians still argue whether sneaking food during fasts was widespread rebellion or quiet survival, with some saying it showed defiance against church control, while others think hunger drove most to break rules with whatever junk was handy. You're leaning toward survival. The crowd laborers, a nun with a guilty glance, looks desperate, not rebellious. You nibble the fritter, and it's a greasy, fishy mess, the oil as sour as Maud's, your throat protesting as you force it down. You think back to Ellen's labor, crafting snacks under pressure, and see these secret fritters as another layer of the junk food world's same bad ingredients, now with a side of sin. The stakes are high. Getting caught could mean public shaming or a priest's penance. And medieval confessionals weren't exactly private. You notice a young apprentice beside you, scarfing his fritter in the shadows, his eyes darting like he's dodging God himself. You're impressed by his nerve but uneasy. Hunger's pushing everyone to risk their souls for a bite. You try another, nibble, hoping it's less vile, but the gristle crunches ominously, and you discreetly drop it into a puddle when Giles isn't looking. You're starting to see why fast-breaking snacks were a medieval guilty pleasure, and why they were just as disgusting as market staples. You're tempted to confess your bite to a priest, but the alley's secrecy feels safer. The alley's gloom rats scurrying. A distant tavern shout grounds you in this rebellious world. The cauldrons sizzle a quiet defiance against the church's rules. You think of modern diet cheats sneaking chips on a cleanse, maybe, but without the spiritual stakes, and almost laugh. This is medieval indulgence, with a side of survival roulette. You're starting to get why people broke fasts, why a greasy fritter trumped a holy vow. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like scarfing pizza during a vegan challenge and hiding the box. The market's din echoes faintly, but there's a story in every forbidden bite, and you're ready to keep going. Joke number 1. If this fritter was a sin, it'd be gluttony with a side of please don't tell the priest. You're slipping out of the shadowy alley, the greasy fritter's sour tang still haunting your taste buds. Its oily crumbs joining the chaotic mess on your wool tunic. As you step back into York's bustling market square, the faint sizzle of Giles's forbidden cauldron fading behind you. The market stench sour ale, rotting fruit, rancid fat traps around you, but a softer spring breeze hints at change. And you're here to reflect on the legacy of medieval junk food as the gritty stalls and their disgusting snacks fade into history's haze. Mainstream history tells us medieval junk food, moldy bread, wormy fruit, ale-soaked scraps was a gritty necessity, feeding the hungry in a world of scarcity. Its influence lingering in modern street food and fast food traditions, though with far better hygiene. You're leaning against a wobbly market cart, its load of wilted cabbages a reminder of Watt's desperate alley scavenging. Watching vendors like Ellen and Dickon pack up as the day wanes. The air's lighter now, the sun breaking through clouds, and you're clutching a bruised appleworm free, for once feeling the weight of this world's harsh, flavorful story. You glance at Ellen, her flour-dusted hands still shaping dough, her fritters no less rancid but born of grit and skill. The market's pulse moldy loaves, spiced scams, secret fast-breaking bites lives in her work. In Watt's hunger, in Lord Reginald's tainted venison. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval towns held feast-end rituals, tossing spoiled market scraps into rivers to cleanse the season, a symbolic goodbye to winter's grim eats. You imagine Dickon chucking his pies into the Ouse and smirk, good riddance, rancid oil. Historians still argue whether junk food's legacy lies in its survival role or its cultural echo, with some saying it sustained communities, while others think it shaped our love for quick, cheap bites. You're leaning toward both. These stalls fed body and spirit, their flaws paving the way for today's food trucks. You bite the apple, its tartness clean and pure, a quiet victory over the market's rot. You think back to Giles's sneaky fritters, Ellen's labor, used corrupt, ledger each a thread in a tapestry of hunger and hustle, woven through a world where every bite was a gamble. The stakes were high. Every moldy crust or wormy apple tested resilience. Yet people ate, survived, and built traditions that outlasted the filth. You recall the noble feast's spoiled delicacies, proof no one escaped the era's food roulette, and marvel at how they turned scraps into sustenance. The market's slowing now, vendors packing carts, the stench softening as spring's green promise stirs. You're impressed by their legacy, not just surviving, but shaping a food culture that echoes in every greasy fry or street taco today. You're tempted to grab one last fritter for the road, but your stomach vetoes the idea. Still scarred from Maud's oil, you're starting to see why this junk food mattered. Why its story is as enduring as the market's cobblestones. You settle against the cart, the apple's juice a faint balm, the market's hum creaking wheels, fading shouts lulling you into its final rhythm. You think of modern snacks regulated, packaged. Safe and see faint echoes of this square's raw, reckless spirit. You smirk, picturing a modern equivalent, like grabbing a hot dog from a cart and savoring its greasy charm. No worms required. The sun dips low, and you're ready to let this world drift, its lessons as lasting as spring's first bloom. Wind down your resting now, the market fading into a gentle blur, the stall's stench softening to a whisper. The weight of moldy bread, rancid pies, and sneaky fritters dissolves, leaving only the murmur of spring and the calm of a world turning anew. You're safe here, wrapped in the quiet of a place that fed its people, its resilience glowing like embers in your mind. Let your breathing slow, each exhale long and easy, your body sinking into the cart's steady frame. The stories of Watt, Ellen, and their gritty snacks linger, but they're distant now, blending into the dawn's tender light. You don't need to hold them. The market's din fades. The air grows still, and you're drifting, carried by a peace as steady as spring's return. Sleep's waiting, gentle and sure, ready to cradle you like a vendor's hope for a better day. Close your eyes, let go, and rest.